Many animals are remarkably capable of generating force and redirecting it to maneuver. A prime example of these feats can be seen when observing a moth feeding from a flower. The moth needs to both generate enough force in the vertical direction to offset its body weight, and then also redirect that force to maneuver when, for example, a flower begins to oscillate after a gust of wind. Ultimately, the locomotion of animals results from the combination of both neural mechanisms and the mechanics of the organism. The field of neuromechanics has identified both sensory motor and mechanical processes that contribute to the effective locomotion in a few disparate species. Yet both the morphology and physiology of animals have diversified with the functional demands associated with different behaviors, the invasion of new habitats, and the differences in life history. And this leads to a huge diversity across animals. In the moth superfamily, bombycoidia is a prime example of such diversity. The superfamily contains the diverse sister families, the sphingids, known as the hawk moths, which are highlighted in red, and the saturniids, known as the wild silk moths, which are highlighted in darker blue. And this is a good example of two closely related groups of flying insects known for their differences in life history, flight behavior, and ecology. The hawk moth clade is known to exhibit extremely elegant and maneuverable flight. This is a group known for its ability to sustain long-duration bouts of hover while feeding from a flower, which is a task requiring high power output. Differently, the wild silk moths, they don't even feed as adults, and they're known for their erratic flight behavior, where the moth pitches and bobs vertically up and down, which in addition to elaborate wing morphology, is thought to be a bad avoidance strategy. So again, we have this context surrounding the silk moths that they can accomplish these rapid maneuvers when escaping from predators. In addition to the divergence in life history, feeding habits, and flight behavior between hawk moths and silk moths, we've shown that in parallel, wing shape also diverges strongly between these two groups. Wing size is another thing that varies between the two clades. When we look at the relationship between body mass on the x-axis and wing area on the y-axis, we find that while a similar range of body masses have evolved between hawk moths and silk moths, for a given body mass, wing area is larger in a given species of silk moth in comparison to a given species of hawk moth. And when we take a purely morphological approach, we can infer the functional consequences of the divergence in wing shape and size by calculating morphological metrics with known aerodynamic consequences. First, hawk moths are a radiation of particularly high aspect ratio wings, which help reduce the power requirements of flight by reducing the induced drag caused by wingtip vortices. Differently, silk moths have evolved low aspect ratio wings, which in comparison to high aspect ratio wings of the same area can aid in maneuverability. Silk moths, because of the large wing area to body mass ratio, have also evolved low wing loading, which is known to increase maneuverability due to the relative force produced for a given body size. Finally, hawk moths have evolved wings of a higher radius of the second moment of area, and when total area is kept constant, a wing with a higher radius will be more efficient at force production because of a higher proportion of the wing area is located distally where induced velocity is the highest. However, because both wing morphology and wing movement have a profound impact on the aerodynamics of flight because of the unsteady aerodynamic mechanisms that these species rely on to fly, it's necessary to also consider wing movement when inferring the aerodynamic performance of flapping flight. And that leads to two important questions that I want to focus on for the remainder of the talk. First, how does wing movement diverge between the two clades? And second, how do wing shape, size, and movement combine to impact force production and power requirements of flapping flight? Okay, so we've seen a divergence in life history, flight behavior, and wing morphology between hawk moths and silk moths. But how do species belonging to these two different clades move their wings? So to answer this question, let's first pick a representative species from each family that are relatively widely separated in morphospace. So while we have a lot of diversity, we also have these two major trends. And the first thing we wanted to do is examine the differences in the general trends between these two clades. So we took our representative species from each clade, and we put them in a wind tunnel, and we filmed them with 3 calibrated high-speed cameras. And from these videos, we obtained the 3-dimensional kinematics of the wings. One aspect of wing movement that differed between the two groups is wing stroke amplitude, and that's what we have plotted here, with amplitude on the y-axis and wing stroke cycle on the x-axis. And we see that Actias luna, plotted in blue, uses a larger wing stroke amplitude in comparison to Eumorpha acamon. A second major kinematic difference between these two species is wing beat frequency, and Eumorpha acamon uses a wing beat frequency more than 2 times greater than that of Actias luna. And finally, a third major axis of kinematic variation is stroke plane angle. Eumorpha acamon uses almost a horizontal stroke plane, while the stroke plane of Actias luna is nearly vertical. But that was only a two-species comparison, and we wanted to know how general these differences are across and within the two families. So we sampled several other species from each family with decent coverage across the phylogeny. And we find that yes, these are indeed relatively consistent, with silk moths employing wing strokes of greater amplitude, more vertically oriented stroke planes, and of lower frequency in comparison to the hawk moths. So now that we've seen wing movement also strongly diverges between at least 5 representatives of each family, we can take these data and use them to determine how shape, size, and movement combine to produce the aerodynamic force and power of each species. So because we've convinced ourselves that these two species are actually a pretty good representation of the general wing shape, sizes, and movements of their respective families, we're going to focus on just these two species to do our deeper analysis of the functional consequences of these variables. So when we combine the morphological data with wing kinematic data and then employ the help of an amazing engineer, Usama, we can use a blade element model to obtain the quasi-steady aerodynamic forces of the wing throughout the wing stroke cycle. And I wanted to quickly flash the equations of our model in the video so you can pause and go over these in more detail if you wish. But briefly, we used a quasi-steady blade element model to calculate the total aerodynamic forces as the sum of the translational force, the rotational force, and the force due to added mass. And we rotated the force from the wing coordinate system to the body coordinate system. And here are the total aerodynamic forces in the z direction of the body coordinate system for each moth. And while the peak and average magnitudes of the forces are similar between species, we can see a major interspecific difference when comparing the sign of the z-force over the second half of the wing stroke. And what I want to focus on is the functional consequences of this z-force asymmetry for Actias luna. If you remember at the beginning of the talk, I commented on how silk moths are known for their bobbing flight behavior, where the body vertically oscillates up and down when these moths are flying. These data now show how these vertical oscillations, which are typical of silk moth flight, are actually being produced. This means that over the course of the wing stroke, the moth is actively accelerating the body upwards during the first half and actively accelerating the body downwards during the second half of wing stroke. So we're now finding that aerodynamic differences between hawk moths and silk moths are directly translating to differences in flight behavior between at least these two species. Next, I want to break down this model further to investigate how these interspecific differences in force are actually being produced. So we created additional models where we kept variables constant between the two species and systematically varied these different aspects of the system that can contribute to force production. So in our second model, we keep wing shape and size constant between the species and only differ wing kinematics. And from this, we can see that the interspecific differences in z-force production are driven by interspecific differences in wing kinematics, particularly stroke plane angle. However, given the low frequency of Actias luna, our force magnitude is significantly reduced, which means that force magnitude must be modulated by either wing shape or wing size of Actias luna. So in model 3, we could give our solid line model back the wing shapes of Actias luna. And when we do this, we actually see that the magnitude of our forces decreases. And this is because hawk moths have evolved wings of a higher radius of the second moment of area, which can increase force production in comparison to a wing of lower radius and equal area. But finally, we could compare the impact of wing size by comparing the solid line of model 3 with the blue line of our base model. And we can see that it's the wing size of Actias luna that enables this species to produce the magnitude of force we see in the base model, which is necessary to offset body weight. We can also use these data to make general estimates of the induced power requirements of each species. Induced power is the power required to overcome the induced drag on the wing and represents the cost of imparting sufficient downward momentum to the surrounding air to offset body weight. And we can see that Actias luna actually has a lower induced power requirement in comparison to Eumorpha acamon. And this is because induced power is related both to wing size and the amplitude of the wing stroke. And because both of these variables are generally larger in silk moths in comparison to hawk moths when comparing a species of a similar body mass, we can expect to see these trends hold up generally between these two families with a few exceptions. So let's summarize our findings a bit to this point. First, hawk moths and silk moths have evolutionarily diverged in both their wing shape and wing movement. Hawk moths have evolved high aspect ratio wings, which is advantageous for reducing power, and silk moths have evolved large sized wings and move those large wings at a slow frequency and very high amplitude to reduce their power requirements. Next, the production of sufficient Z-force necessary to balance the weight of the moth is primarily driven by high-frequency movements in hawk moths and large wing size to body mass ratios in silk moths. And finally, we see that the evolutionary divergence of hawk moth and silk moth wing shapes leads to shapes that are favorable for maneuverability in silk moths, but not in hawk moths. Despite that, it's very clear that hawk moths have evolved a means to accomplish rapid maneuvers. We suggest that hawk moth wing movement, particularly the evolution of high wing beat frequencies, has a significant role in flight control. Not only do high wing beat frequencies increase torque production, but they also allow an animal to have more opportunities per unit time to control and redirect the force vector. So in conclusion, we find that the aerodynamic performance emerges from the interaction of wing shape, size, and movement. And silk moths and hawk moths have evolved two distinct strategies for flapping flight. Species of both families have evolved mechanisms for producing force and reducing power, but do so with distinctly different wing shapes and movements. The ability for natural selection to act both on shape and movement to impact power requirements in force production demonstrates the potential decoupling of locomotor performance metrics. And this decoupling might reduce morphological constraints that would drive the convergent evolution of wings to meet one or few advantageous shapes, leading to a diversity of wing shapes that we now see across extant aerial animals. And with that, I'd like to thank so many folks, especially in the Sponberg Lab, the Kawahara Lab, Hamilton Lab, and so many other colleagues along the way. And thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.